There's a motion at the desk. The clerk will report the motion.
Pursuant to Article 4, Section 19 of the Constitution of the State of Minnesota, NISCA moves that the rule therein be suspended and an urgency be declared, and that the rules of the House be so far suspended so that House Law Number 5 be given its second and third readings and be placed upon its final passage.
I call on Representative Niska to explain the motion.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. This is our K-12 education bill authored by Chair Joachim, and it was the result of a bipartisan bicameral working group as well. The final language has been posted since the 7th, and I urge members to support the motion so we can finish our work today.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Long.
I also urge support.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion prevails. The clerk will give the bill its second reading.
Second reading, House File Number 5.
Second reading. The clerk will report the bill.
House File Number 5, an act relating to education, modifying provisions for pre-kindergarten through K education, providing policy and funding for general education.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, the author, Representative Joachim, to explain the bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Before you is House File 5, which is the K-12 Education, Finance, and Policy Bill that we'll be considering today. It's a product of 7 days of negotiations between the House and Senate working group that included myself, Co-Chair Krisha, Co-Vice Chair Clardy, Co-Vice Chair Bakeberg, Co-Chairs and Co-Vice Chair of Education Policy, Representative Jordan and Representative Mueller, as well as the Senate Chairs Kunesh and Swedinsky and Senators Gustafson, McQuaid, and Rarick. When the bill left the House floor, we did our thank yous then, but I would like to give another shout out to our incredible nonpartisan and partisan staff that make up the House Education, Finance, and Policy teams. We really couldn't have done this without your professionalism and your incredible work ethic. The House and Senate passed an education policy bill out of their respective floors and started negotiations during regular session. In a bit, I will hand it over to Co-Chairs Representative Jordan and Representative Bennett to explain the portions of those negotiations that we folded into the bill before you today. When the Education Finance Bill left the House floor, we were working with a target of $40 million to the positive in the first biennium for the READ Act and a zero target in the tails. What we were able to do in that bill was to provide some flexibility in funding streams that districts had been asking for while protecting the integrity of what the funding streams were intended to be used for. That is what we brought as the House to the table in the working group. The Senate brought a bill that had made it out of their Senate Finance Committee. And the joint targets we were given to work with were a zero in the first biennium and a $420 million cut in the tails. Provisions of the House bill that remain the same that are in House File 5 are investments in consolidation aid, the Compensatory Revenue Task Force, roofs included in long-term facilities maintenance levy, non-public pupil aid, a special education teacher apprenticeship program at a smaller dollar amount. We maintained the one-time grants to MapStars and the Minnesota Youth Council, as well as a one-time increase to the Math Corps. We funded the same legislatively appointed grants from the House bill in the first biennium and removed their base funding in the tails. Unfortunately, Santa Foundation only maintained their current funding in 2026 as a one-time appropriation. We were also able to include increased grant oversight provisions, but one of the most important items we were able to maintain was indexing the general education formula to inflation to provide our school districts with an increased investment of 2.74% in 2026 and 3% in 2027. Indexing really brings stability to our school districts' budgets and at least a 2% increase in the general education formula each year. In accordance to the leadership agreement, we provided the state agencies with their operating adjustments, removed the repeal of the unemployment insurance for our integral school hourly workers, and there was an addition of a Blue Ribbon Commission to look at slowing the growth of special education costs. The Blue Ribbon Commission accounts for about $250 million of the cuts in the tails that will come from the special education cost subsidy if the commission does not find an equivalent amount of savings before the 28 and 29 biennium. Appropriations were increased to fund the governor's request for MDE's legal costs and their fraud detection and prevention provisions. Additional appropriations that came into the working group from the Senate were funding for compensatory revenue hold harmless, provision and electronic library grant, and grants for cardiac emergency response plans in our schools. There are two working groups that were brought over by the Senate. One to look at an age which students are provided developmental delay services, another to look at exemptions to the current ban on using seclusion rooms for our K-3 students. There's also a dual language immersion advisory committee that we fund within the READ Act. During third reading, Representative Clardy and Representative Mueller can briefly go over the changes to the READ Act from the original House bill. Finally, members, there were a few additional reductions and new cuts that the working group had to make to meet the joint budget targets. We had to make additional reductions in student support personnel aid to give back the Senate some of their library aid that we had reallocated in the House bill. We also moved up the reduction to the special education transportation reimbursement from 95%, from 100%, we had it at 95% from 100 across the board, but now we have it starting at 90% in 2027. We canceled some more interactions between MDE and Carrie at the U of M regarding portions of the READ Act implementation as well. The new reductions since we left the House floor are in some of our teacher pathway and mentoring programs, a decrease in the student support personnel workforce grant, reductions in the tails for the Minnesota Independent College and Community, Minnesota Principals Academy, and a trim to the full-service community school base. We also reduced the supplemental school lunch aid from 12.5 cents to 6.25 cents in the tails, as well as removing the telecommunication access aid. The last new reduction was to charter school tuition billing aid, which a lot of folks don't know about, but charter schools receive the same amount of funding per pupil as our traditional schools do for students that receive special ed services. To make up the difference of the aid to actual cost, our traditional public schools have cross-subsidy aid that they dip into. That cross-subsidy aid before 2019 used to only be 7%. In 2023, we were able to raise it up to close to 50%. Now, charter schools don't have cross-subsidy, but they're able to bill back 80% of their cost difference to a student's home district while also receiving 10% of that remaining cost difference in aid from the general fund. We decreased that aid from 10% to 6% instead. So members, that's how we met our cut target, and all of these reductions were incredibly difficult to make, and we did our best to keep the majority of the reductions out of the classroom. I have hope that we can cushion the cuts if we have a supplemental budget or raise new revenue to work with next year. We worked hard to maintain indexing the general education formula to inflation and prevailed. We were also able to provide some additional compensatory aid that the state budget brought to the Senate budget brought to the table. I believe that this bill is the best result we could accomplish to provide funding for our schools given the budget targets. It invests in our students and school districts for the next 2 years. I will be voting yes, and I would appreciate your support as well. I will turn things over to Chair Krisha, who will then send it to the Education Policy Co-Chairs.
I recognize the member from Morrison, Representative Krisha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Co-Chair Joachim. A lot of what was covered thoroughly by my co-chair, who's always way more detailed than I am, but I do want to jump off into a huge thank you for the staff, the nonpartisan staff, Mr. Strom, Ms. Beckel, and yes, anchovies and mac and cheese, and as well as, it's one of the favorite meals we had during our negotiations, and Christina Para, Ms. Para. So thank you to the staff, the partisan staff on the DFL and the GOP side, just fantastic. Just as I said in one of our other comments, that they were partisan when they needed to be, and they were nonpartisan when they had to be as well, and that helped us get through a lot of the negotiations. House File 2433 that came off the House floor was a very strong bill. At that point, we were able to preserve the budgets and no cuts, but unfortunately, we were forced to take a $420 million reduction in the tails that was put to us by Governor Walz. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in closing comments. But a couple of things that I just wanted to add is the strong position and strong relationship the House had going into conversations in the working group. And I can tell you, when you stand shoulder to shoulder and you have differences, but you find your areas of agreement, you can put a good compromise bill together and this bill will be a functioning bill. A couple of things that are very important is keeping away the cuts that were proposed by the governor and the Senate DFL to non-public education and protecting educational choice, as well as leaving the homeschooling language that was proposed at one point from the Senate with some amendments. Those would have been very detrimental and did not need to come into this bill, and we were able to keep those off. There's also a couple of pieces here in some rider languages where we removed the equity, diversity, and inclusion piece for MDE, as well as put some guardrails around the legal money that they have and that they use that for the lawsuits that are in front of them right now. The other thing that I just want to call out as we go in a little bit further is the importance of bringing the long-term facilities maintenance for roof repair in for the schools, the rural schools. Thank you, Representative Bernig and Representative Bakeberg, for that. That was very, very important, and we needed to fight for that. And I can tell you, in being in those conversations, at one point, I was able to look with my colleagues right at the governor's staff and right at the commissioner and say, this has to be in the bill. We can't have a bill that does not take care of one of the biggest asks that's happening for our rural schools. So that was very, very important. And then the last thing that I'll say before I turn it over to the policy chairs and then do closing comments later is knowing the difficulties of the compensatory, and when we got down to it, it was very difficult to choose between the basic supplemental aid, which was way more flexible, and refilling and holding harmless the compensatory aid. We have the working group, and Representative Feist has been working very hard on that, and that working group hopefully will yield some results rather than just more money, because we have to fix that formula. As I said in the working group, and as I said in our open hearing, this bill, in my opinion, is the canary in the coal mine for schools. Pay attention, because 2 years from now, things get immensely more difficult if economic conditions persist. And it's a call to them. With declining enrollment, with special ed, and where things are at and those rising costs, this bill will hold them for 2 years, keep them above water, while they have to look at what's going to happen down the road. And many of the superintendents that contacted me, Representative Hansen, you opened up on 2433 and talked about the importance of this for South St. Paul. We heard that. Talk to your superintendents, talk to superintendents across the state. The compensatory aid, as I said, that will keep some jobs, that will hold schools for planning, but the uncertainty still persists, and we're not going to be able to hold that out forever. So again, members, we're going to be hopefully not debating this bill long, but talking about the merits of it as we move forward, and with that, I'll hand it over to the policy chairs.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Speaker Damath. As far as the education policy provisions goes, it's a very, very, very similar bill to the one that was passed off of the floor of this body. The biggest disappointment is that we lost provisions related to the Office of Inspector General at MDE. We tried very hard. We had a good bipartisan push for that, but the Senate just would not take it. They had their own ideas about OIGs, and it did not involve the ones that we had brought forward. The biggest pickup was provisions related to charter school accountability that brings their accountability measures in line with what is expected of our traditional public school districts. And we also accepted 2 provisions from the Senate related to Native American mascots and Native American drumming ceremonies at graduation. Those are the big changes with the education policy bill. Most of it is the same as the one we passed off the floor of this body. And with that, I'll yield to Representative Bennett.
I recognize the member from Freeborn, Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Speaker Damath. Members, and as Co-Chair Jordan said, this is very, very similar to the bill that passed off of the House floor before the end of session. I would like to mention a few of the provisions in the policy portions, just kind of highlight. First of all, thank you to Representative Bakeberg for his provisions that empower school districts and reduce the power of the Department of Education. You know, the Department of Education is valued, but our school districts actually deserve to be in the driver's seat, and that's what some of his provisions do. Thank you to Representative Mueller for her short call substitute pilot program, now becoming permanent. That's going to help our schools. And also, Representative Mueller, thanks for all of your work on the science of reading language, and Representative Clardy as well. You worked great together as a team. I would echo the sentiments of removing the OIG language from this bill. There was a lot of fraud protection in it, and we know that a good portion of the fraud that's already been uncovered happened under the realm of education. We should be dealing with that more. I will say I'm happy that some of the fraud components that I actually had in a bill ended up in this final policy portion of this bill. And that would, not only do we roll back funding for legislatively named nonprofits, but this language I worked on reduces the potential for fraud by requiring MDE to terminate grant agreements under certain conditions. For example, failure to maintain tax-exempt status, failure to file timely IRS forms or financial statements, failure to meet applicable state charitable reporting requirements, and failure to maintain proper and timely registration with the Secretary of State. We do have a provision that allows MDE to continue a grant agreement if the nonprofit first contacts MDE to discuss the issue and work out a plan for achieving compliance. I think some of those will help with the fraud issues that we are experiencing. It is incredibly unfair to taxpayers, all Minnesotans, to allow any of their money to be stolen by fraudsters. I would just close in saying I think there are a lot of good components in this bill, but I'm also incredibly disappointed that we were not able to do more to make some impactful fixes for mandate relief. Our schools are sinking under all the mandates that are required of them. They're financially sinking as part of that, and we really were able to do very little to fix things for districts. To me, a lot of it is just kicking the can down the road. That's not fair to our schools, and it's especially not fair to our kids. We're cutting schools and increasing agency funding. I think that's really wrong. And basically, what I see is schools are experiencing a gaping wound, and what we're doing here is just injecting a little bit of numbing agent around that gaping wound. We need to deal with it more effectively and actually make real fixes for our kids and for our schools. I'm hoping we can do that in the future and continue our work. So thank you, Madam Speaker.
There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill a third reading.
Third reading, House File number 5.
Third reading. Discussion to the bill. I recognize the member from Anoka, Representative Engen.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I actually didn't want to be on the list, but I'll say a couple brief words. I really did enjoy being on this committee. I learned a lot, and I didn't expect to be on it. But I think that it's time that we start actually taking into account the voices and the concerns of those who actually do the work, the experts on the ground, the teachers, the students, the staff that are in our schools every day. And one voice that I believe does that better than anybody is Representative Bakeberg. He takes the time to go and listen to people and schools all over the state in districts that he doesn't even represent and wants to make sure that their voices are brought into the fold. And so I really do respect both chairs. I respect the way that Representative Krisha, the way that you led this committee and made all of us feel involved. That meant a lot. And so whichever way you're voting on this, I really do appreciate the work. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Dakota, Representative Clardy.
First of all, I just wanted to thank the chairs for their great work on this bill. There are 3 provisions that I just wanted to uplift. The first one has to do with the READ Act, and it's a provision put together by Representative Perez. And she's been out in the community talking to parents and students, administrators, teachers, to find out what's needed in a multilingual school. And so because of her hard work, in this bill, there's going to be a task force, or not a task force, a work group that's going to look at what's going to make all our kids really good readers. And the next one I wanted to uplift is the kindergarten entry assessment. This is something that happened actually back in the trifecta, but we are bringing it forward to make sure that our kids are ready. This is for all kids that are entering kindergarten. We hear a lot about kindergarten readiness. Well, the kindergarten readiness is really the schools, because as you know, the kindergartners are ready to go to school. So this will be a tool that schools will be able to use to know what they can do to help students advance. And the last one has to do with the apprenticeship program. And I know you've heard me speak of this one before, but I'm very, very proud of it. It happened to be the first registered one in the state of Minnesota, and the focus is on special ed. It's done with our intermediate districts, and with the intermediate districts, that basically reaches out to over 45 schools. So initially, they started with the 4 intermediate schools, and they have a class of 22 that'll be graduating soon. And what that means is that they've had an experience for an apprenticeship, so they are working full-time in the setting that they need to know the skills of special ed. They are working with an expert teacher, and they're getting on-the-job training. If you think about it, most student teachers only get like a very short period of time where they're there for 2 years. The beauty of this program is that there's so many people that are working at these settings, and they haven't had maybe the means or the time to go get their degree. So they're working in conjunction with the University of Minnesota at Mankato State. And when they finish, they will have a degree in special education with 2 endorsements, one for emotionally and behaviorally disturbed, and the others with the autistic spectrum disorder. So these are 3 provisions that I think will just really make a difference in our kids' futures. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Mauer, Representative Mueller.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, members. It was a privilege to be able to work with the chairs and the coach and the vice chairs here. It was also a privilege to work with Representative Perez-Vega and with Representative Clardy. All of us care about literacy and about our kids reading, and it was such it was so inspiring to be able to work with such strong women who care so much about our future generation. And so thank you for letting me be a part of that. I am completely inspired by the fact that we have parents and children who have very different experience from some of us, where they are in dual immersion programs, and they are learning in a way that is so powerful. So the only time I've ever experienced it is when I was an adult, and I lived in China for 3 years, and I lived in a place where there was no English, it was only Chinese, and so you either learn Chinese or you don't eat, and so those were your options. And I tell you, it was really amazing to be able to learn how to use the language as quickly as possible, and we have our kids doing that, and so seeing them learn in 2 languages or more languages is just really exciting. Of course, I've stood up on this House floor so many times to talk about the science of reading, and I'd like to say, members, that we have finally seen some movement with that. Literacy is one of those bipartisan issues that got frustratingly partisan last time, and so I'm really excited that in Article 4 in the READ Act, we now have a policy statement at the very beginning that says it is the intent of the legislature that public schools promote foundational literacy and grade-level reading proficiency through the use of curricula, textbooks, instructional materials, instructional practices, interventions, and teacher development and training aligned with the science of reading, and that we also have that in the science of reading and structured literacy. I will tell you, House members, colleagues, we stood firm on this. And this wasn't Republican, Democrat, this was House Senate. And we prevailed because it was very obvious that we were going to say, either you put the science of reading in here, or we're not moving anymore. And I think it's very telling that the House stood strong on this, because we know how important it is for us to have our kids learn how to read. We know the generational change that happens when kids can read. And it's really emotional for me because I know, and Representative Clardy knows, and people who work with at-risk population, they know what happens when we have an illiterate population. The chance of being incarcerated, the chance of living in poverty, the chance of being underemployed, that is all tied to being able to read. And we will have conversations about the READ Act from time memoriam, and to know that we now have policy that's going to be based on the science of reading is so important. The other thing that was really important was to be able to redirect funding more towards our schools instead of on Carrie. Carrie was trying to make sure that we had research developed and reviewing curriculum, and a lot of schools found it to be rather unhelpful. And so rather than spend extra money on a tool that was actually a barrier to schools, we severed that relationship, and that will be severed November 1, and then the rest of the contracted money will be redirected. The READ Act provisions was the last thing to be negotiated in the bill. And I will tell you that it was very, as I said, it was very rewarding to be able to finally get the Senate to agree to some of these things so that we could get this together. And while I thank my House members and the chairs and the leadership on the things that they've done, it is unconscionable that we are giving more money to our agencies while we're watching our schools be cut in ways that they shouldn't be. We listened to the Senate say that they wanted library books more than they wanted mental health services. No. We're facing a $6 billion deficit, and the first place we start should be our agencies, and yet they're the ones getting the increase. And I will tell you, I helped negotiate a lot of this bill. And yet, to know that we couldn't even negotiate how much money our agencies get, knowing that they have been lacking in their duty, as we saw with chronic absenteeism, as we saw with reading instruction, as we saw with different other areas, standing in the way of innovation, as we saw with Representative Clardy's bill. And yet, they're the ones getting the increase, and our schools are getting the cuts. It's not okay. And we as leaders should be listening to our schools about what they need and have fair and flexible funding. Mandate relief. And instead, in a time where we should be looking at places for us to shrink government, to give more money to our schools, we are growing it. I can't look my teachers, my students, my families in the face and tell them that I voted to give more money to bureaucrats rather to their schools. I don't blame any person for this. This is what happens in divided government. I understand that. But when we think about the future of our state, it's not okay. Thank you to the many people who stayed up hours to negotiate this bill. Thank you to our researchers, to our CAs, to our CLAs. It was a privilege to be a part of this process. And I hope that as we come together in 2026, that we continue to look at how we can do better for our schools. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize a member from Scott, Representative Bakeberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And before I talk about the education bill, if I could just take a moment, to say happy anniversary to my wife. 24 years ago, I outkicked my coverage greatly, so happy anniversary, Lindy. I also I want to thank Co-Chair Joachim and Co-Chair Jordan and Bennett and Krisha. It was an interesting dynamic as we were negotiating this because we've had some very robust conversations in public, on TV, and in behind closed doors as well, talking about what is best for our schools. And it really, honestly, was kind of a unique situation to be united. And I want to just recognize my DFL colleagues for that and for the work that we did. So there are some good provisions in this bill, and it has been talked about. The attendance work that Representative Keeler and I have worked on and started, and we would invite all of you. This is a start. We have a lot of work to do. But there's some provisions in there. The READ Act that was talked about, investing in literacy, helping our kids learn how to read, that's foundational. We just had the transportation bill, and I've talked a lot about this. I see literacy much like roads and bridges. It's critical infrastructure for our future, for our kids. The local control pieces, the innovation pieces, our local school districts, our local school boards, to be blunt, know way better than we do on how to manage things. And we have to get to a point where we trust them to do that. The compensatory hold harmless, that's something that many schools were asking for. So that is a good thing. And Chair Joachim talked about the inflationary index. And that is true that it helps school districts plan. But that also leads to the budget reality that our schools are going to be facing. Because Chair Joachim also talked about that there's over $350 million in cuts related to special ed, part of a blue ribbon commission, that if we do not find reductions, that is going to come out of the formula increase in essence for schools. That is a direct cut. That will mean less teachers. That will mean less services, less programs to kids. Within this bill, and that one's coming, so schools know that that's coming, be planning purposefully. In this bill, we have $71 million in cuts. And Chair Joachim walked through where many of those are coming from, but those are programs that we're supporting kids. So that back of the napkin math, about $421 million in cuts to schools. Now, Chair Joachim was right. We did our best to try to keep that away from the classroom, but it's coming out of the classroom, folks. We're kidding ourselves if we don't recognize that it's coming out of the classroom. Okay, and the $71 million in cuts, I want to take a moment, and I know how hard that was for Chair Joachim, and a lot of that came from student support personnel. And I want to recognize that there was give and take, but that is a cut to our schools. That is less money. The library aid is less money to our local school districts. We need to be honest about what is happening. And honestly, I'm okay with the reductions given our budget reality if we weren't giving $17.7 million to the department. Just think about that. Go back to your local schools, go back to the teachers, go back to the paras, the principals, the superintendents that are negotiating contracts, and just tell them we needed to give the agency their increase. And I get that was a leadership decision, and frankly, I 100% disagree with it, and that frustrates me. But the reality of it is that our schools are going to be cutting teachers, cutting employees. They did it this year. They will be doing it in the future. The other reality, and this is what is infuriating to me, the other reality is those same educators that get cut from working in the classrooms, the Department of Ed will be hiring. So maybe you can get a job at the department because they are hiring. And that is a sad reality. So in the future, what we have to focus on is Representative Myers had a bill. We could have chosen, and we cracked the door a little bit with lunch, with universal meals. $112 million we could have put into basic supplemental aid for our schools. We made a choice to not do that. That bill will still be there next year, and I promise you we will continue to have the conversation. Very, very few educators that I have talked to have said that they disagree with that bill. And I know many of you have a different perspective, and that's okay. But I would encourage you to be talking honestly, regardless of what the executive branch, their priorities are. We are our own body. And that's probably my biggest frustration in the time I've served here, is we're too worried about what other people might think of what we do. We have to stick to our convictions. And one of the things that we need to do is look at every single bucket of money about how we can support our schools, because we are going to continue to be working next year around mandate relief, funding flexibility, and local control. If you're interested in any of that, I don't care if you're far right, far left, moderate, I'll work with you on that. The other piece that's not in this bill that is maddening to me is that we could not do work on discipline. Our schools are screaming for relief. And we allowed activists to get in the way of solving real problems for our schools. Just today, the other thing I heard about driving up, a principal that I actually went to undergraduate with called about PSEO. We need to do some work around PSEO as well. And Representative Keeler, I look forward to continuing to work together on the attendance pieces that we need to do. And we need to do what is right for our kids, regardless of what people outside of this body, agencies say. We need to do what's right for kids. And if you're willing to do that, I'm willing to work with you. All right, thank you.
I recognize the member from Morrison, Representative Creasha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, members. A couple quick closing comments. First of all, I want to thank the committee members. A number of things happened in the committee that I hope people took home with them. When we first started, we encouraged members just to start sitting on either side of the table and getting to know each other. And notably, members did that. And I think that collaborative attitude worked its way all the way up. And Chair Joachim and I also passed that down. But what that did was it showed, as Representative Bakeberg was asking, that even though we may start off with disagreements on issues, once we start talking our way through and we find out where the commonality is, we can get to a solution. And I think that carried its way all the way through. And we have lots of themes like that for next year. We're going to have to look seriously at compensatory. We're going to have to look at the discipline issue. We have to look at the attendance issue. And the READ Act and all of those are going to continue to evolve and have to get stronger in the schools to increase the opportunities for the students. And Madam Chair, before I go into any further comments, would Representative Engen yield for a question?
Representative Engen will yield. Representative Creasha.
Representative Engen, one of the things that I want to call out, and you had an amendment but didn't offer it, was the SHIELD Act. And that is another area of commonality that I think we should look at and talk about. Representative Engen, if you could just give me 2 seconds or 30 seconds on your work in that area.
Representative Engen.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And yes, thank you, Representative Creasha. It's actually kind of the reason that I'm here. One of the first times that I remember wanting to get involved in trying to make a change was after a school shooting that occurred in 2008. I was very young, but I recognized that I was sitting in a classroom and felt pretty vulnerable. There wasn't much that myself or my peers could do if, God forbid, the worst case scenario had ever occurred to us. And so I actually found a Minnesota-based LLC that's doing some awesome work, created a comprehensive multi-layered school safety equipment system, and wanted to do something about it. So hopefully we get it done in the future.
Representative Creasha.
Thank you, Representative Engen. And it's issues like that that we have to keep bringing to the table. So thank you, Representative Engen, for bringing that back. So members, House File 5 that's in front of you, when House File 24 left the floor with 93 votes, that bill provided $40 million in one-time funding for literacy, no cuts to overall education, and the bill prioritized local control, funding flexibility, and mandate relief. The bill put teachers in classrooms over bureaucrats and agencies. I wish I could say the same here. We had a very strong bill that left the House floor, no bill that passed the other body, and then unfortunately we were left with a situation where the governor and the agency was in the room, which essentially gave them veto power way too early in the process. At the demand of Governor Walz, the bill before you slashes education spending by $420 million in the tails. These cuts will be real, with more than $350 million in reductions in state spending on special education and $71 million to other school-related programs. Again, this is the canary in the coal mine. We have to watch it. We could have done this without the cuts. There's ways, as we showed with House File 2433. You've heard of the talk of the Blue Ribbon Commission. Members, the Blue Ribbon Commission will be real cuts. That $250 million cuts will fall to special ed, which will fall to the cross-subsidy, and it will require MMB to reduce the state spending on special education aid by $125 million in the year beginning in 2028 and going forward. Even for this commission, the governor demanded that we provide $125 million to the agency, $125,000 to the agency for these cuts for the Blue Ribbon Commission. So we tried to make the Blue Ribbon Commission find its own spending, but apparently the governor didn't find that as palatable as we did. While I don't support the special education cuts, and they're going to be tough, and the schools to fund the bureaucracy, which we see, I am pleased that this bill provides a functional budget for our schools. It really does. This will provide a base for the schools over the next 2 years as they prepare for what's coming. I am pleased that the bill will crack down and terminate payments to nonprofits that put and that with some of the provisions that were put in place by Representative Bennett, that we can hold the nonprofits to the level of standard that they should have if they get the funding and that they keep their stability. I am pleased the bill removes the legislative mandates that MDE have an equity, diversity, and inclusion center, and I call upon the governor to focus those funds on literacy, numeracy, science, and skill training rather than ideological agendas. I am pleased the bill makes teaching literacy through the science of reading the policy of the state and prioritizes evidence-based practices over politics. One of the provisions in the bill is a modest redirection of funding from universal meals to support school libraries. As we face a mandated reduction of $125 million per year in special ed funding for the next biennium, we will need to look in every line for funding to save special education. Members, this bill provides a functioning budget for our schools. This bill will allow local control and allow school boards to make the decisions they need to save the classrooms and the teachers as they prepare for the next biennium's cuts, if they're still there. I want to thank my co-chair, Rep. Joachim, and the policy committee co-chairs, Representative Jordan and Representative Bennett, for their work in this historic session. It really has been historic. I want to thank our vice chairs, Representative Bakeberg and Mueller, for their important input and contributions to this bill. And again, thank all the committee members. As the co-chair of the Education Finance Committee, I'll be voting for this bill. I think it's important that we have a 2-year level of certainty and funding for the schools, but knowing that our work will really be in front of us as we look forward to the biennium after that. And I would urge the governor to stop going around the country and showboating and get back here and look at what's in front of you, look at the policies that we have, stop touting your crazy education, that you're the education governor when you forced $420 million cuts on us. There's tough choices to be made, and there were some compromises that had to be gained. I will simply ask for your consideration for this bill. And so members, I recommend a vote on this bill.
I recognize the author of the bill, Representative Joachim.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Co-Chair Krisha is always the hard act to follow. But I was reminded too to thank we're really lucky to have such a great committee, and we had a great working group, but we kind of have an embarrassment of riches in our education committee. Not only do we have a principal with Representative Bakeberg, we have current and retired teachers of Bennett and Clardy and Mueller and Hill and Rayrauer and Ream. We have other people that have worked in schools, me as a para, and then others working directly with students with Sensor Murrah, Representative Krisha, and Paris Vega. And then we have multiple members whose parents have worked in schools, and of course members who have volunteered in their students' classrooms. So we're just really lucky to have so much experience at the table. But members, I know this is not the bill either of our caucuses would have voted on, would have written up by ourselves. It's a reflection of a tied House and negotiations with the other body, as well as a cut target. While the additional 2.74% to our school districts this coming school year, and 3% the next, our schools still need additional investments to make up for 20 years of underfunding. So I'm hoping for a better forecast or maybe some revenue raisers next year. A cut budget was hard to work with, and we did our best to keep the majority of the cuts away from directly in the classroom. And hopefully that Blue Ribbon Commission does find that $250 million of slowing growth in special ed. But the investments that we made in 2023, 2024 really made it, helped tremendously to soften the blow. So members, I want to also remind you that this bill also has an investment in compensatory aid, keeps the continued investment in our schools with indexing, still provides an increase in student support personnel aid from last year, continues to take care of our hourly workers, will help get more teachers in our classrooms, and funds our K-12 schools for the next 2 years. It's a good bill, members. Please vote green.
There being no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. The clerk will call the name of the member participating remotely.
Olson.
House File 5, Olson votes no.
Olson votes no.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 97 ayes and 36 nays, the bill is passed and its title is agreed to.